Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this webinar into the employee engagement trends for 2019. For anyone who isn't familiar with Harris Interactive outside of our consumer research offerings, we've been delivering transformative insights to clients for around 20 years now through various technology solutions and delivering transformational truths that will help organizations understand the realities of the data from their surveys. It's helping to create change and create even better places to work. We're constantly leveraging the use of customer technologies, and we're encouraging greater use of those to develop new and deeper insights. And we're also encouraging clients to focus on more fluid and agile ways of listening, particularly around the employee ecosystem, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. A little bit about me before we move on. I've had the honor of working with some incredible organizations in the UK and overseas for the last 10 years of my career, and this covers all sectors, all industries. I share their passion for creating organizations in which people can thrive. It's something that I love to do. It's something that I'm really proud of. And I think whilst organizations differ greatly just in terms of their own objectives, their industries, their sectors, there's something that's common amongst all of them. People and their aspirations tend to be the same. And I think that's why it's great to have events like this where we get to share things that are consistent across all organizations, because they're consistent across people. Most organizations are at a different stage in their own journey. So it's really important to remember that whilst we're sharing insights today, which are around, what's typical, certainly in the UK, it's really important to focus on what's next for you and your own organization. So we're delighted that so many of you joined us today. And if there's just one or two things that you'll take away from today's session, which will give you new or different ways of looking at your own challenges, it will have been a really good 30 minutes of your own time. So we're here to share, obviously, the insights on our engagement priorities. Why? Because for the last 3 to 5 years, we've been seeing similar trends from the studies we've been conducting with clients. I spend a lot of time with senior audiences talking through their survey results, and the same things are coming up time and time again. I think there's a certain sense of reassurance that for most of you out there, that your challenges will be similar to those being faced by other organizations. It's not something you might be aware of because obviously you tend to look at your results internally. It's something that we have visibility of. What's interesting is this year especially, those same trends have come up very strong in our own work-life study, which I'll cover in just a moment. In today's session, we're going to be having a brief review of the actual research itself, so you can understand the background and methodologies. We'll look at the 5 priorities that were out in the invitation and just give a bit more clarification on what it takes to actively engage people. There's some key takeaways, so ways of looking at the data and the insights from your own organization differently. And then we'll have a quick wrap up where we look at how you can use research to keep you ahead of what's next. So introducing our work-life study. It's something that we launched in 2018 and it's going to become an annual event where we went out to a panel of employees across the big 5 European countries. Whether or not the UK will be one of those big 5 European countries is still to be decided. We reached out to 8,500 respondents, which gives us unbiased opinions about their attitudes towards work and life today. It's unbiased because we're not using the data just from the organizations who we work with and partner with, who have a vested interest in creating great places to work. It's objective feedback. It helps us to create benchmarks, and it helps us to explore emerging trends as well. So we don't just only capture insights into experiences of work and the employee ecosystem, but we also get to explore trends, and hot topics such as mental health, Brexit, artificial intelligence, and various other topics. Today's insights are based on the responses from UK respondents, and we have got some research reports which are available from our website, so you can navigate there and get access to those reports. So before we get into the detail about what's driving engagement, it's really important that we all have a shared understanding of what we mean by engagement. Now, most of us will have a good understanding that it's this deep emotional connection to the organization, and it's measured through various components. We're talking about alignment to objectives, motivation, pride, satisfaction, commitment, advocacy for the organization or its products and services. We all measure engagement in around about the same way, and we would all agree that it's based on the same sorts of construct. The industry itself was once dominated by agencies and management consultancies where the measure itself was actually the focus, whereas these days we sort of collectively agree that as long as you're measuring these components in a roundabout way, you're probably getting a good measure of engagement. So we're much more fluid these days in terms of what we use to measure engagement. Interestingly, in our work-life study, we actually tested some new questions as a way of trying to understand, is there a catch-all question that could measure engagement? There was one in particular that stood out and had really strong reliability and correlated very highly with all the engagement measures. And that was, when I wake up in the morning, I feel positive about going to work to do my job. We're not yet comfortable enough to say that that is the one question that measures engagement, but it goes to show that actually thinking has evolved, and there might be more holistic ways of measuring engagement than just having a series of questions and just having one. You'll all be familiar with the results from your own surveys, that engagement is something that it's yours to lose, essentially. When employees come into your organization, they're at the most engaged, and that's where you will see the highest levels of engagement. But over time, that slowly diminishes. So if employees are coming into the organization fully engaged and then they're losing that engagement over time, it's essentially something that's yours to lose. And it has to be earned. It's earned through the employee experience. So these are the things that we're going to cover in today's session, but also more than that. So in the invitation, and something that would have hopefully attracted you to join today, was where we've highlighted our engagement methodology, which is around what it means to be actively engaged and the 5 priorities that have come up. Essentially, we use a model called active engagement, where employees have to be fully engaged. That means they've responded positively to all 6 of the engagement statements that we use to define our index. This starts off with a general sense of job satisfaction. We then move up what we call a pyramid. So employees aren't just satisfied with their job, but they're also motivated to do their best. So at a respondent level, an employee has to be both of these things. We then add in the other questions, which creates segments. So we move up the pyramid, and we're essentially creating segments it's a model of diminishing returns, and we end up with employees who are satisfied with their job. They're also motivated. They're also satisfied with the organization as an employer. They're committed to the organization's goals. They're also going to recommend the organization as a good employer, and they have a strong sense of pride. Only when an employee feels all 6 of these things are they considered to be actively engaged. We then, obviously, as this is a method of segmentation, we obviously name all of these, and we think of those who are at the bottom of the pyramid who are just satisfied with their job. They come to work because work is just a job, whereas those who are at the top of the pyramid are actively engaged. The method that we've used for this analysis is looking at the difference in opinions between people who are actively engaged and to those who come to work for where it's just a job. And that helps us to understand what defines people who are actively engaged. Where do we need to focus our efforts across the whole organization to create more of that, to create more pride, to create more recommendations, to create more commitment, motivation, and satisfaction. And this is what has led us to our 5 kind of priorities for engagement for 2019. We've essentially looked at the most significant gaps, which align very closely with various statistical types of analysis, but it's a much easier methodology to understand. The difference between those at the top of the pyramid and those at the bottom, so those who come to work and are engaged and those who come to work and it's just a job, are the 5 things that would have attracted you to our session today. Organizational change, voice of the employee, confidence in the future of the organization, progression, and what we call the fair exchange. We'll dive into these areas in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But I think before we go into that, I'm keen to understand whether or not these are priorities for your organization. So through the power of technology, we have a bit of a quick poll that's just going to pop up on your screens in just a second. If you could select all that apply in terms of those 5 themes that have come up as a priority, we'll share the results with you in just a second. Whilst you're completing that poll, I think it's really interesting to note that because we're looking at people who are actively engaged, these are people who whose basic needs are being met. So anyone who might be familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from psychological research, we tend to find that basic needs at the bottom, so enablement, pay, salary, some of the basic hygiene factors to the job prevent people from getting to these higher levels. Actually, the key things that differentiate those who are actively engaged from those who come to work for just a job aren't actually the hygiene factors. So the results of the poll are already in, and we're about to share those with you now. It's really interesting to see that actually the priority is organizational change has come up as one of the most frequent drivers of engagement in your own organizations, followed by career and progression. So a slightly different order, but again, up there. Voice of the employee, confidence in the future are there. And interestingly, the fair exchange is perhaps one of the least important. And, that's the order of the themes we're going to go through. It means we'll spend a little bit more time perhaps focusing on organizational change today because it's come up as the biggest priority. So moving into that quite swiftly, organizations where people reach the highest levels of engagement do change well. And that's quite a broad term. So what do we mean by this? It means that organizations are good at delivering change, just general change management. It means employees feel adequately supported through the change process. It's not something that's necessarily done to them. They're involved as well. They're consulted. It's actually an activity in which people feel that they contribute. So organizations that do change well have higher instances of people who are actively engaged. Through the study, we asked employees whether or not their organization was going through a period of significant change. And when we look at the responses for just those employees, similar sorts of trends came through. These organizations need to be good at delivering strong communication. They need to create a strong sense of involvement when change is being implemented. And reasons and decisions for change need to be transparent and clear. What's really interesting is there's a common misconception, I think, amongst employers and people within our industry that employees are resistant to change. That's not the case. Our study actually shows that 90% of those who are actively engaged and 81% of those who come to work for just a job are actually positive about change. They're not actively negative about it. So, everybody's positive about change. It's just that their experience of change in their organizations differs quite significantly. So we need to think about creating engagement by delivering change well, by supporting people through the change process, by consulting and involving them, whether or not they're engaged. If we think about organizations that do change well, the biggest change right now is Brexit. And regardless of what side of the fence you're sitting on, I think it's a perfect example how not to do change. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. There's a lack of clarity of what's happening. There's very little buy-in in terms of whether it's the right or the wrong decision, either side of the fence. And we use these insights from Brexit to really understand how organizations can learn from what's happening out there. Our Brexit research, again, it's available on our website, and there's some really interesting facts about optimism and whether or not people are engaged. But essentially, organizations that do change well have a greater buy-in in terms of attitudes towards Brexit and life after Brexit. There's a huge difference and significant difference in engagement. So employees who work for organizations that do change well are much more optimistic and much more engaged. So there's certainly a link there. And if we look at people who are optimistic about Brexit because of what their organisations are doing, their organisations are delivering change well. The difference in the responses to a series of questions is as much as 30 to 40% difference between organisations doing change well. So, there's certainly some learnings there. Some of the noteworthy observations from our Brexit research around engagement trends are very consistent with what we need to be delivering different for organisations going through change. It's about good change management. It's about supporting careers. It's about satisfaction specifically with reward in this instance, but also the employee voice. So attitudes towards being optimistic around change are the same attitudes that we need to shift to create high levels of engagement. So there's a lot we can learn from Brexit. The second area that came up was around the employee voice. And, we're listening more than we have done ever before. And I think it's really important to continue listening and continue to provide an outlet for employees to have a voice. And this matters regardless of how engaged employees are, whether we look at those who are actively engaged at the top of the pyramid or those throughout any of those different segments. Feeling that or having an outlet for employees to share their thoughts, concerns and opinions is important. It's very easy to think that employees who are less engaged don't care about their voice being heard. Actually, that's not the case. There's been many instances where I've spoken to organisations and employees across organisations who think, well, why should I bother saying anything because nothing will happen? Actually, they still want their voice to be heard. They might be cynical, but they still have a voice and they still need to know that it matters. What this actually means for organisations is we need to focus on making sure that employees know that their opinions count. So not only having a listening mechanism through standard surveys, pulse surveys, various different types of community platforms, it's actually making sure that they know their opinions count. So this is communicating that they've been listened to. And that really comes from the leadership of the organization, taking feedback seriously and sharing across the organization that not only are we listening to what you are saying, we have heard what you've said. They're two very different things. And it's about being visible in responding to the feedback that's come through, taking action, communication, having work streams that really show that there is a response to what has been heard. Employees who are actively engaged see and feel these things coming from their organizations. The third area that came through as one of our priorities is around optimism about the future success of the organization and where the organization is heading. It's not just about being positive about the future. The specifics are understanding how the organization is delivering against its strategy, goals and objectives, understanding that and knowing that the organization is doing the right things to create success. And it's about feeling positive about the future of the organization. A lot of this is around the strategic direction of the organization and what employees are hearing from the top down. We often talk about transformational leadership here. So this is a kind of a new term that again has been coming to the forefront in the last couple of years, and it's where leaders are being challenged to focus more on defining purpose and strategy, inspiring mission statements, telling stories, rallying people around a vision through motivation, and having coherent goals and objectives. So this is really a call to action for leadership to demonstrate more transformational leadership capabilities. If we then move on to looking at the fourth area, which was around supported development and career progression. So this, I think, came up in the poll as being the second biggest priority for those of you who have joined us on today's call. It's actually been a driver quite consistently for perhaps more than the last 3 to 5 years. It's always appeared as, the top 5 priorities for me, but it's becoming more and more important. It's shifted, however, from traditional training. So I think, maybe through 3 or 5 years ago, it was more about training. So, access to training, face-to-face training and those sorts of things. But the paradigm has shifted and now it's much more about development and growth. So we're seeing a greater requirement of those who are actively engaged for better support from managers and managers getting actively involved in an individual's career, being genuinely interested in how they move forward and not necessarily upwards. It's about having clear career paths, so very transparent organizational pathways to success for the individual. It's not necessarily knowing that there's opportunities to progress, but knowing how to progress. It's about putting it down on paper so that an employee can see these are the steps that I need to follow in order to grow within this organization. And it's also about having access to opportunities. It's one thing to have a career path within an organization and know how to progress. It's another thing to actually have roles to move into. And this is quite a common source of frustration at the moment. What we are seeing is there are greater expectations on employers. I think this is really interesting. So in sort of yesteryear, I'm showing my age now, we used to see a lot of individuals self-managing their own careers and their own development. We're now actually seeing a shift to greater expectations on organizations to support learning, growth, and development from the organization itself. And I think when we actually looked at the results of our survey, we saw that there is the same amount of self-development or attitudes towards taking ownership of one's own career is about this, has remained about the same, but actually there's been a shift towards people wanting more from their organizations, and this creates challenges in this day and age. And those challenges come from a major shift in the change in the generational workforce. So we're all sort of talking about millennials and I guess Gen Z, who are now coming into the workplace. They're going to make up over half of the workforce by 2020. That's only just over a year away. An interesting fact here, 42% of the respondents from our survey actually were in this group. So we're quite close to hitting that number already. And because of the shift in generations, we're seeing a shift in the requirements of our approaches to learning and development, growth in career. We need to start thinking differently about how we meet the new expectations of this new generation. They are responding in the same way that they're taking their own responsibility for their own learning and development, as I just mentioned. But what we're seeing is a shift to increase expectation on organizations, and this is where the challenge comes from. The types of things they're looking for are greater creativity, sideways movement, not necessarily upwards movement, clearer direction in how they progress, more feedback-driven cultures so that their managers are giving constant feedback, which perhaps was something that individuals had to sort of do themselves in the past. They're looking for enrichment and something that's more purposeful. It's also a much more transient workforce, and I think we need to recognize there's lots of external factors here. For example, we have less home buyers, which means people have the ability to shift jobs and shift location. They're not wedded to their career in one organization like they used to be. There's greater visibility of what their peer groups are doing because we've got technologies and people are sharing their career paths, and it's creating aspirations and inspiring people to move on and be more transparent. And we're also seeing some of the external factors such as general aspiration shift. So people want new and better things. They're seeing that and they want it and they'll go and chase for it. So the generational shifts outside of work are influencing how individuals think about their careers within work. And then finally, the last component of or the last action area of employee engagement is around fair exchange. And this is essentially what I get in return for my time. It's about concern and support for well-being. It's about feeling valued and appreciated for the organization and for the work I give to the organization. And it's this feeling of reward, total reward, not just pay. This isn't about give me more money for my job, because that's quite common. Actually, if we wrap all of this up together, it's the sense of what do I get in return for my time and effort and what I give to this organization. We're seeing a much stronger focus on this sense of fair exchange being a priority. So one of the things that's become more and more important is the top mention, which is care and concern for employee well-being. This is a real kind of talking point right now. We're all talking about mental health in the workplace, and it's becoming an agenda point for most organizations. We've moved past free fruit in the office and discounted gym membership and, you know, all those sorts of frills. And actually, we're now being challenged with facing up to our responsibilities as employers around how we support mental health. And again, we've released a paper on this, which is available from our website with loads of really interesting facts. We found a 16% difference in engagement between those who are experiencing mental health challenges and psychological strains compared to those who don't, leading up to the survey. So there's a real call to action here that we need to be doing more to support those with psychological challenges, because actually it's affecting their engagement. If we actually look at some of the differentiators between people who suffer strains, it's about believing that their organization focuses on well-being as a priority. It's about enablement frustrations, but it's also about line manager support and capability and trust in leadership and direction. Again, these are common threads that we're already talking about. These are really familiar concepts that are threaded throughout some of the things that we've been talking about today. So moving on quickly, you're probably thinking, wow, there's a long to-do list there. It's not just those 5 priorities, but there's lots of subcomponents of those. I think the real thing to focus on here is actually when we're talking about how we respond to these challenges in the next 12 months, we don't need to think of them independently as, okay, how am I going to deal with organizational change? How am I going to deal with voice of the employee? And so forth. We actually need to think about the underlying behaviors and the response mechanisms that we have. We're talking about transformational leadership. By focusing on how leaders do things differently, we can tick lots of those boxes. So my recommendation is don't focus on how you're going to deliver organizational change differently, because the key things are around leadership behavior, around visionary leadership, about communicating and bridging the gap between leaders and employees. That's about transformational leadership. It's about communication. And, you know, we can't emphasize this enough. Communicate, communicate, communicate. It's about embracing the new normal, new ways of listening, new generations, not seeing them as things to be disgruntled about, but just embracing them as new challenges and adapting to those. And a way to do this is by keeping on listening and responding. A lot of what we've been talking about today is around what we call the employee experience ecosystem. So most agencies will talk about the employee experience of lots of different components, and these are the things in the middle. These are things that we focus on from our survey. So, you know, change, organizational change, managed behavior, senior leadership, and that we all focus on those to drive engagement, to drive culture, and to drive personal and individual performance, all at the center of this experience. But we sometimes forget there's lots of external factors: technology and the environment, society, the generations, politics, economics, and there's space there for all of these growing external influences. And all of this combined then determines how people feel about your organization, your employee value proposition, your brand, and that results in, you know, new joiner decisions. Do I want to go and work for an organization that can deliver all of this? So I think, you know, not only do we encourage you to think about your drivers as challenges for your current organizations, but think about the impact of external influences and think about the impact they have on people outside of your organization as well. It's about connecting the dots between all of those. Again, that will probably feel like quite a challenge to many of you. And a way to respond to the challenges across the ecosystem is around continuing to listen, but listen in your own way. We're often asked, is the big survey dead? No, it isn't. Supplement the annual survey with listening across between your surveys. Use technology. It's already here. Communities, pulse surveys, targeted listening, face-to-face listening. Design a listening strategy that's around your needs, and keep in touch with your employees and use it as a way of listening and responding to feedback. And this is where we excel. This is what we do to help our client partners research across the ecosystem. We have our own solutions. We have our own reporting platforms. We run pulse surveys through real-time analytics. We conduct advanced analytics and exploratory analysis. And these are techniques that you should all employ to address the challenges and those priorities to keep you ahead of what's next in the next 12 months. Essentially, if you focus your research across the ecosystem, it will keep you ahead of what's next. If you get it right, it will help you to switch on your people through engagement, and it will help you to power up your organization. I'm conscious that we've come through the end of our whistle-stop tour of our insights. I know it was a very quick run through, and we could have run a session in each of those, but we don't have any time for questions. But questions that we have received, we will get back to and respond to you as a follow-up to this email. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this very brief webinar into our engagement trends for 2019. We do hope that they have given you some things to think about. They've reassured you that you're not alone. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be in touch to also find out from you what your challenges are and where we need to focus our future research to help keep you ahead of what's next.